She had read the notice 3 times before she allowed herself to believe it was real. And on the 4th reading, she made up her mind to go. Before we follow Alara Voss through the iron gates of the most feared estate in England, we want to hear from you. Where in the world are you watching this story unfold? Drop your city or country in the comments below, because our viewers come from every corner of the globe, and we love knowing who is with us. And if you are new here, please like this video, share it with someone who loves a good romance, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like this one. Now, back to Alara and the dare that shook all of England. It was the autumn of 1843, and London was doing what London did best, talking. The city's drawing rooms, tea tables, and gentlemen's clubs buzzed with a single piece of news that had arrived not through whisper or rumor, but through formal print. A notice, published in the Gazette and reprinted in 3 other papers within the same week, bearing the ducal seal of Ravensmore and signed in a hand so precise it looked almost mechanical. Let it be known that I, Adrian Ashford, Duke of Ravensmore, shall take as his wife the first woman of suitable birth who enters Blackthorn Hall on the 1st of November and remains within its walls for a period of 30 consecutive days. Any woman who endures the full term shall receive an offer of marriage upon the 30th morning. Any woman who departs before the term concludes forfeits all claim and shall not be considered again. The Duke does not negotiate. The Duke does not explain. A. Ashford, Duke of Ravensmore. The notice was absurd. Everyone said so. Lady Pemberton said so at her Tuesday luncheon, pressing a hand to her throat as though the very words were an affront to civilized society. Lord Cawthorne said so at his club, laughing until his port sloshed dangerously close to the rim of his glass. Even the Duchess of Elmswick, who had seen 60 years of society scandal and claimed nothing could surprise her anymore, said so, quietly, over her embroidery, with a small shake of her head that conveyed more disapproval than any sermon could. Blackthorn Hall was not merely old or isolated. It was cursed. Everyone knew it, the way everyone knew that the Thames ran cold in winter or that the Queen preferred Windsor to London. The estate sat on the northern edge of the Yorkshire moors like a wound that had never properly healed, dark-stoned, sprawling, and surrounded by a tree-line so dense that locals claimed the sun had stopped trying to reach the ground sometime around 1801. 3 women had gone to Blackthorn Hall in the past decade. 3 women had left within a fortnight, each one pale and silent, none of them willing to describe what had driven them out. One had married a minor baronet in Somerset and refused to speak of Yorkshire ever again. The second had retired to the country in what her family delicately referred to as a need for rest. The third had simply wept continuously for 11 days until her mother came to collect her personally, and the Duke had not bothered to see them off. This was the man issuing a marital notice through the national press. This was the house he was offering as a home. And still, impossibly, stubbornly, with the particular brand of recklessness that had defined her entire adult life, Alara Voss read the notice one more time and began to pack. She was not, in the strictest technical sense, a woman of suitable birth. Her father had been a scholar of modest reputation and of modest debts. Her mother had been a clergyman's daughter with beautiful handwriting and an unfortunate tendency to fall in love with impractical men. Alara had inherited the handwriting and, she suspected, the tendency, though she had spent the better part of 26 years keeping it fiercely suppressed. She had no fortune. She had no title. What she had was a copy of Debrett's peerage, a sharp memory, and the knowledge that her maternal grandmother had been the second daughter of a viscount, which was thin, as noble connections went, but it was something. It was, she had decided, enough. What she did not tell herself, not yet, not in so many words, was the other reason she was going. The reason that lived underneath the practical calculations like a stone at the bottom of a clear stream, visible if you looked closely, but easy enough to ignore if you kept your eyes on the surface. The reason had a name, and the name was Mr. Gerald Fitch, and he was the kind of man who made the word trouble feel entirely inadequate. But that was a problem for later. Right now, the problem was a hat. She owned 2, a serviceable brown, one she wore for ordinary errands, and a gray one with a small felt ribbon that she saved for occasions requiring the appearance of dignity. She packed the gray one, If she was walking into a cursed estate to offer herself as a potential duchess, she was going to do it looking as though she had somewhere better to be. The morning of the 1st of November arrived wrapped in fog, so thick it had texture, a gray-white density that muffled sound and turned the familiar streets of her cheap-side lodgings into something half-invented. Alara rose at 5, dressed herself without a maid. She had not had a maid in 4 years, and looked at her reflection in the small spotted mirror above the wash basin with the expression of a woman taking honest inventory. Dark eyes, clear-skinned, a mouth her father had once described as opinionated in its natural resting state. She was not beautiful in the way that portraits were beautiful, but she was striking in the way that a well-made argument was striking, precise, difficult to dismiss, and occasionally inconvenient. She picked up her traveling trunk. She left 2 months' rent on the table for her landlady. She walked out into the fog. The journey north took the better part of 2 days. A coach to Leeds, then a hired carriage to the edge of the moors where the regular drivers stopped and the terrain began. The final stretch she completed in a farm cart driven by an elderly man named Hobbs, who had the decency not to ask her business, but the honesty to warn her, at least once, as the tree-line of Blackthorn Hall appeared on the horizon. "They say it breathes at night," he said simply, without drama, the way a man might mention that a particular road was muddy. The house. "The locals say it breathes." "Houses don't breathe," Alara said. "No," Hobbs agreed. "They don't." He left her at the gate. The gate itself was iron, tall, black, intricately worked with a pattern she could not quite resolve, something that was either flowering vines or reaching hands depending on the angle of the light. Beyond it, a long gravel drive curved toward the house, and the house sat at the end of it like a sentence that had been left deliberately unfinished. It was enormous, dark, beautiful in the way that things which have survived great damage are sometimes beautiful, not despite the evidence of ruin, but because of it. Every window was lit, which she had not expected, and the effect in the approaching dusk was not welcoming so much as watchful. She pushed open the gate. It moved without resistance, without sound, and that, somehow, was more unsettling than if it had groaned. She was halfway up the drive when the front door opened and a figure appeared in the frame. Not a butler, not a footman. A man, tall, dark-coated, standing with the particular stillness of someone who had been watching her approach from the moment she came through the gate and had decided to let her walk the full length of the drive before acknowledging her existence. Adrian Ashford, Duke of Ravensmore, was 32 years old and looked like the northern moors had made him personally. There was nothing soft about the architecture of his face. It was all strong angles and considered severity, a jaw that suggested he had formed opinions, and a brow that suggested he did not share them easily. His hair was dark, slightly overlong in the way of men who had other concerns, and his eyes, when they finally fixed on her as she reached the top of the steps, were the specific gray of winter sky before snow, not cold exactly, but charged, like something was held tightly in suspension. He looked at her trunk. He looked at her hat. He looked at her face. "You are smaller than I expected," he said. His voice was deep and gave nothing away. "You are taller than the notice suggested," she replied. "Though I suppose a duke has the luxury of omitting his physical dimensions from formal print." Something moved across his face, not quite a smile, but the distant cousin of one, gone before it could be identified. "You have 30 days," he said, stepping aside from the doorway. "Do not waste them expecting warmth." Alara walked past him into Blackthorn Hall, and the door closed behind her. In London, the drawing rooms were still talking. They were quite confident she would not last a week. She had every intention of proving them spectacularly wrong. The butler's name was Mr. Crewe, and he had the expression of a man who had long since made his peace with the inexplicable. He was perhaps 60, lean and precise in the manner of someone who had spent decades in service to a household that required the maintenance of absolute composure in the face of circumstances that would have undone lesser men. He took Alara's trunk without comment, led her through an entrance hall the size of a modest church, and gestured toward a staircase that rose in 2 sweeping arms to a galleried landing above. The stone floors were immaculate. The walls were hung with tapestries, so old their colors had softened into something almost dreamlike, burgundy and gold reduced to rust and cream, hunting scenes and mythological encounters blurred by time into a kind of peaceful obscurity. Candles burned in iron sconces at intervals along the walls, and their light moved in the draft of her passing, sending shadows rippling across the tapestries so that the figures in them seemed, for just a moment, to shift. Alara noted this. She filed it carefully. She did not react. "Your room is on the second floor, east corridor," Mr. Crewe said, his voice professionally empty of any editorial position on this arrangement. "Dinner is served at 7 in the east dining room. The Duke dines separately." "Of course he does," she said pleasantly. Mr. Crewe did not respond to this, which she respected. The room he showed her to was larger than her entire lodgings in Cheapside and considerably better furnished. A four-poster bed hung, with curtains of deep green velvet occupied the far wall. There was a writing desk near the window, a wardrobe of dark mahogany, and a fireplace in which a fire had already been laid and lit, the only evidence thus far that someone in Blackthorn Hall had anticipated her arrival with anything approaching hospitality. The window looked north across the rear gardens and then out onto the moors beyond, where the last of the evening light was retreating rapidly, as if it too had curfew in this place. She stood at the window for a moment after Mr. Crewe withdrew. The moors and failing light were extraordinary. Not beautiful in any comfortable or reassuring sense, but extraordinary in the way that great, indifferent things are extraordinary. They did not care whether she found them striking. They simply were dark and rolling, stretching to a horizon that seemed farther away than horizons had any business being, as though the normal rules of geography loosened their grip out here, and everything became slightly more than it ought to be. She turned away from the window and began to unpack. In London, she knew, the news of her departure had already begun to circulate. She had no family left to worry over her. Her father had died 3 winters ago, her mother a year before that, but she had a small circle of acquaintance, and amongst them Mrs. Hartwell, the widow who occupied the rooms below hers in Cheapside, would by now have read the brief note Alara had left on her door and would be, in all probability, somewhere between bewildered and quietly furious on her behalf. Mrs. Hartwell was the only person who knew about Gerald Fitch. She had not approved then, and she would not approve of this, but she would keep the secret, because Mrs. Hartwell's displeasure was always private. That was one of the things Alara valued most about her. She hung her 2 dresses in the wardrobe, the dark blue wool and the green muslin that was better suited to warmer rooms, and set her books on the writing desk. 3 of them. A volume of essays, a novel she had read twice and was beginning a 3rd time, and a small leather-bound notebook that she used for the private accounting of her thoughts. These were the materials of her interior life, and she arranged them with the care of someone who understood that the interior life was, in the end, the only territory she truly owned. Dinner was brought to the east dining room at 7 precisely by a housemaid who gave her name as Polly, and who could not have been more than 17. With round cheeks and the wide, cautious eyes of a creature that had learned to move quietly in uncertain environments. Alara thanked her warmly. Polly seemed startled by this, then pleased, then hastily professional again. "Will you need anything else, miss? Is there a library in the house?" Polly blinked. "Yes, miss. The west wing, past the portrait gallery." "But," she stopped. "But," Alara prompted, gently. "Most of the guests don't tend to." Polly stopped again, seemed to reconsider the word guests and whatever associations it carried, and tried again. "Most people who come to stay don't usually. They keep to their rooms, miss." "Mostly. How many rooms have there been to keep to?" Alara asked. Polly's eyes moved sideways toward the door, as though checking for the proximity of authority. "3, miss. Before you." "And how long did the longest one last?" A pause. 12 days, miss." Alara picked up her fork. "Thank you, Polly. I won't be needing anything else tonight." She ate her dinner, which was, she noted with some surprise, excellent. Braised beef and roasted root vegetables, and a bread that was still warm from the oven, and thought about 12 days, and what might have driven 3 separate women out of a large, well-staffed house in under a fortnight. She was not, by nature, a fearful person. She had learned, through necessity, to make a clear distinction between what was actually dangerous and what merely appeared so, and it was her considered view that appearances accounted for a great majority of the world's fears. A house could be dark and strange and full of unsettling drafts without being genuinely threatening. A man could issue a peculiar public notice without being genuinely unhinged. She reminded herself of this as she made her way to the library after dinner. The portrait gallery, as Polly had described, connected the east wing to the west, and Alara walked through it slowly, candle in hand, letting her eyes move along the rows of painted Ashfords that lined both walls from floor to ceiling. They stared back at her with a shared quality of all aristocratic portraits, a studied composure, a conviction that being looked at was a condition to be borne with dignity rather than reciprocated with any particular warmth. The early Ashfords were Tudor in style, flat-faced and formal in their ruffs. The later ones grew more naturalistic, their expressions more complex, their settings more elaborate, as though each generation had slightly more interiority to express and slightly more confidence in art's ability to express it. She was near the end of the gallery, almost at the library door, when she stopped. The portrait was hung in the last alcove before the western arch, and it was set slightly apart from its neighbors, as though it had been placed deliberately at a remove. The subject was a woman, young, perhaps 25, with dark eyes and a composed, particular expression that Alara could not immediately categorize. Not happy, not unhappy, something more specific than either of those things. The woman's hair was dark, worn in a simple arrangement at the nape of her neck, and she was dressed in deep green, the same shade. Alara noted with a small chill that she firmly declined to indulge, as the curtains in her bedroom. Beneath the portrait, a small brass plate bore an inscription. Miss Cecily Marsh, 1821. No other information, no title, no relationship to the Ashford family explained. Just a name and a year, and the woman's dark eyes looking out of the canvas with that unreadable expression that was not quite peaceful and not quite resigned and not quite anything Alara had a word for. She stood there for a moment longer than she intended to. Then she went to the library, found 3 volumes that interested her, and went to bed. She slept initially, without difficulty, the particular dreamless exhaustion of a long journey settling over her quickly. But she surfaced, once, in the deep middle of the night, pulled upward by a sound she could not immediately locate. Not a dramatic sound, not a crash or a cry. Something subtler and stranger than that. A sound almost like breathing, low and rhythmic and slightly too large for the house to contain naturally. It moved through the walls rather than along them, the way sound moves through stone when its source is very old. She lay still and listened for exactly 60 seconds, counting deliberately. Then she turned over, closed her eyes, and went back to sleep. She was not going to give the house the satisfaction. In the morning, she rose, dressed, and came down to breakfast with her notebook under her arm, ready for the day. Mr. Crewe materialized in the corridor with the quality of a particularly well-trained apparition, and informed her that the Duke breakfasted in his study, and was not to be disturbed before 10 o'clock. "I had no intention of disturbing him," Alara said. "Quite," said Mr. Crewe, in a tone that suggested he reserved judgment on this point. She was finishing her second cup of tea when Adrian Ashford walked into the breakfast room at 12 minutes past 10, stopped in the doorway when he found her still at the table, and looked at her with the expression of a man who had expected to find a note of resignation on his hall table, and had found instead an inconvenient person reading an essay collection. "You're still here," he said. "I am," she agreed. "Did you sleep?" "Reasonably well. Your house makes interesting sounds in the night." Most people find the sounds rather less interesting and rather more alarming. "Most people," she said, "are not me." He stood in the doorway a moment longer. He was not, she noted in the morning light, what she would have called handsome in any conventional sense. There was too much tension in the set of him for conventional handsomeness, too much of something held carefully back, like a sentence stopped before its most important word. But he was compelling. There was no question of that. "There are rules," he said, moving to the sideboard and pouring himself coffee without looking at her. "For your time here. I assumed there would be. You will find them written out in your room. Mr. Crewe will have placed them there this morning." He paused. "I trust you will read them carefully." "I always read carefully," she said. He glanced at her over his shoulder, just once, just briefly, and something in the quality of it suggested that he believed her, and was not entirely certain how he felt about that. He took his coffee and left the room without another word. Outside, the moors stretched gray and enormous under a sky the color of pewter, and somewhere in the depths of Blackthorn Hall, a clock ticked steadily toward the second of 30 mornings. She had not fled in the night. She had not flinched at the sounds in the walls. She had come down to breakfast with a notebook and an essay collection and a second cup of tea. Adrian Ashford, in the privacy of his study, set down his coffee and looked at the wall for a long moment. Then he picked up a pen, drew a fresh sheet of paper toward him, and began, without quite knowing why, to think about what kind of woman read essays for pleasure in the breakfast room of a cursed house the morning after her first night within its walls. He wrote nothing down, but he thought about it for considerably longer than he had intended to. Blackthorn Hall had a way of showing you things at the edge of your vision, things that were never there when you turned to look directly. Alara discovered this on the second morning in the corridor outside the library, when she caught a movement in the long mirror that hung between two of the sconces and turned sharply to find nothing behind her but empty hallway and the slow drift of candle shadow. She stood still for a moment, regarding the mirror with the calm, forensic attention she might give to a document she suspected of containing a forgery. The mirror was old, very old, its silver backing mottled and darkened at the edges in a way that disrupted the reflection, softening some angles and deepening others, creating in the peripheral areas of the glass a slight distortion that the eye, if already tense and watchful, might resolve into the suggestion of movement. She nodded once, satisfied with this explanation, and continued to the library. She had read the Duke's rules the previous evening, as instructed. They had been written on heavy cream paper in that same precise hand she recognized from the published notice, letters that leaned neither left nor right but stood perfectly vertical, as though each one had been individually considered and placed with deliberate exactitude. There were 6 rules in total. The first, she was not to enter the east wing beyond the door at the end of the portrait gallery. The east wing was locked, the door was marked, and the matter was not open to discussion. The second, she was to take all meals in the east dining room. The Duke would not share meal times. This was not negotiable. The third, she was not to question the staff about the history of the house, its former occupants, or the nature of any sounds, sights, or occurrences she might experience during her stay. If she had concerns, she was to bring them directly to the Duke. She should expect a measured but final response. The fourth, she was not to receive guests from outside the estate during her 30-day period. Correspondence could be sent and received through Mr. Crewe, who would screen it for appropriateness. The fifth, she was not to ask about the curse. This rule had been written in slightly darker ink than the others, as though the pen had been pressed with more force, and it was the only rule accompanied by anything approaching explanation, a single clause, added beneath it in smaller letters. Asterisk, the matter is closed and has been closed for some years. Continued inquiry on this point will result in immediate termination of the arrangement. Asterisk. The sixth rule was the shortest. Asterisk, you will find no comfort in this house. If you require comfort, you should leave now. Asterisk. She had read all 6 rules twice. Then she had turned the paper over, found it blank on the reverse, and written in her notebook. Asterisk, Rule 5 is the most important. Rule 6 is the most honest. Asterisk, then she had gone to sleep. On the third day, she found the portrait gallery again, this time in full morning light, with a pale November sun making a genuine effort through the gallery's high windows, and she walked its length more slowly than she had the first evening, stopping before each portrait in turn. She was looking for Cecily Marsh, not because the portrait had disturbed her, she told herself, but because it interested her. There was a difference. She was a woman who had always been interested in what others avoided. She found the alcove at the far end of the gallery and stopped. The portrait was there. Cecily Marsh, 1821. The dark eyes, the composed expression, the green dress. But in the morning light, with the advantage of time and steadiness rather than the wavering candlelight of her first passing, Ilara noticed something she had not registered before. It was not the face, precisely, though the face was striking. It was the hands. Cecily Marsh had been painted with her hands at rest in her lap, and the artist had given them an unusual degree of attention. Every knuckle and fingernail rendered with the kind of care typically reserved for faces and jewelry. In the right hand, held so loosely it was nearly invisible, there was a small folded piece of paper. Not a letter, too small for that. A note, perhaps, or a card. And the way the hand held it, the slight tension in the fingers, the suggestion that the grip might tighten rather than release if pressed, told Alara something that the composed face above deliberately concealed. Cecily Marsh had been frightened. She stood before the portrait for a long time. Then she took out her notebook and wrote, Asterisk, who is she? Why is she here? Why does she have no family name on the plate? Only a year. Why does the year read like a warning? Asterisk. She closed the notebook and went to find the library. The library at Blackthorn Hall was extraordinary. 2 full stories of shelved volumes lined the circular room, accessible on the upper level by an iron walkway, and a spiral staircase that was either charming or treacherous, depending on one's balance and relationship to heights. Alara had both balance and an excellent relationship to heights, and she had already spent the better part of 2 afternoons on the upper walkway, moving slowly along the spines and finding, to her genuine pleasure, that the Ashford collection was not merely large but thoughtful. Someone had read these books. Not all of them, and not all recently, but enough. There were penciled annotations in the margins of the natural philosophy texts, underlined passages in 3 separate editions of Milton, and a copy of Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Woman that had been so thoroughly engaged with it had essentially become a conversation rather than a document. She pulled the Wollstonecraft from the shelf and examined the marginalia. The handwriting was different from the hand she knew from the rules and the notice, smaller, faster, with the particular velocity of someone writing in the momentum of strong feeling rather than careful composition. A man's hand, she thought, but not a young man's hand. Someone in middle age, perhaps, or someone young, but carrying something heavy. She was still turning pages when a sound made her look up, not the ambient sound of the house, not the distant possible breathing she had catalogued and set aside, but a specific, located sound. A footstep on the iron walkway above her. She looked up to find Adrian Ashford on the upper level, standing at the railing and looking down at her with an expression she could not read from this angle. Only the shape of it, which was not angry and not welcoming, and was something in between that had no convenient name. You found the library, he said. His voice carried well in the circular room. I found it on my first evening, she said. You have a remarkable collection. A pause. My grandfather assembled the greater part of it. And the marginalia? In the natural philosophy section? In the Wollstonecraft? Something shifted in the set of his shoulders, visible even from below. My father, he said after a moment. He read carefully. He read everything. Another pause, longer this time. It didn't help him. She waited to see if he would continue. He did not. She held up the Wollstonecraft. May I borrow this? He looked at the book. Something moved through his expression with the speed of a cloud crossing the sun. There and gone, unidentifiable. You may borrow whatever you like from the library, he said. That is not one of the rules. I noticed the rules were silent on the subject of books. The rules cover the matters of genuine concern. I've been thinking about the rules, she said, keeping her voice conversational, pleasant, deliberately free of provocation. I find them interesting. He descended the spiral staircase with the careful economy of a tall man in a narrow space and appeared at the bottom, close enough now that she could see his expression properly for the first time this morning. There were shadows beneath his eyes, the kind that suggested not a poor night's sleep, but a habitual relationship with insufficient rest. He had dressed today with the same severe precision as always, dark coat and dark waistcoat, a cravat tied with the same exactitude as his handwriting. And the overall effect was of a man who had decided that external order was the appropriate response to internal chaos, and had committed to this position absolutely. Interesting in what sense? He asked. In the sense that 5 of the 6 seem designed to prevent me from discovering something, she said. And the 6th seems designed to prevent me from becoming comfortable enough to stay long enough to discover it. He was quiet for a moment. His gray eyes held steady on hers, not hostile, she thought. Something more careful than hostile. something that was paying close attention. "The rules are designed to make your stay manageable," he said. "For both of us. And the East Wing is not your concern." "You mentioned that, yes. It was Rule 1. "Then you understand it clearly." "I understand that it exists," she said. "I don't yet understand why." "You don't need to understand why. You need to observe it." She tilted her head slightly. "Do most people observe rules more readily when they don't understand them, in your experience?" "I find the opposite is generally true." There it was again, that movement at the corner of his expression, the distant cousin of a smile that vanished before it could be confirmed. He reached out and took the Wollstonecraft gently from her hand, examined the spine, then returned it to her. "Most people," he said, "have left before reaching day 3. I know. 12 days was the record, according to your housemaid. I didn't tell her to share that information." "You didn't tell her not to," Elara said. "That might be worth adding to the rules, if it concerns you." He looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that was conducting some internal assessment, measuring something she couldn't name against some standard she wasn't privy to. Then he said, with a precision that matched his handwriting, "You are not what I expected. You said something similar on the first evening. About my size. I was referring to something other than your size." "I know," she said. "So was I." He turned and walked to the library door. At the threshold he paused, one hand on the frame, and looked back over his shoulder in a way that had the quality of something he had decided to do against his better instincts. "There are paths through the rear gardens," he said. "They are maintained if you wish to walk. The moors beyond the eastern boundary are not safe in uncertain weather, and the weather here is frequently uncertain. I would recommend staying within the garden walls." It was not warm. It was not an invitation. But it was, she recognized with careful precision, a concession, a small voluntary offering of information, the first she had received that had not come filtered through Mr. Crewe or the sheet of cream-colored rules. She treated it accordingly, not with excessive gratitude, which would embarrass them both, and not with the cool acknowledgment she might have given a stranger's directions on a street corner. Something exactly between the two. "Thank you," she said. He left without responding. She stood in the library for a moment, the Wollstonecraft in her hands, listening to the particular quality of silence his departure left behind, fuller than ordinary silence, somehow, as though the room had contracted slightly around the shape of him while he was in it, and had not yet fully expanded back. She went to the window, which looked toward the rear of the house. Below, the gardens were exactly as he had described, maintained, geometric, the bare winter structure of hedgerow and path still legible beneath the seasoned stripping. Beyond the garden wall, the moors began, and beyond the portrait gallery, at the end of the corridor Elara had not yet reached, the east wing waited behind its locked door in the kind of silence that was not the absence of sound but the presence of something that had been very deliberately quieted. She opened her notebook. "Day 3, she wrote. The house shows you things at the edge of your vision. The Duke shows you things at the edge of his words. I think they may be hiding the same thing. Outside the window, the November light was already beginning its early retreat, and the moors went gray, then darker gray, then the particular color of night that has no moon and doesn't need one. Blackthorn Hall settled around her like a held breath. She did not release it. The confrontation, when it came, began over a map. Elara had found it on the morning of the 5th day, tucked inside the back cover of a volume of estate records she had pulled from the lower shelves of the library with no particular agenda beyond the satisfaction of systematic exploration. It was a hand-drawn floor plan of Blackthorn Hall, old, the ink browned, and the paper softened to the texture of cloth at its folds, and it showed in careful architectural detail the full layout of the house across 3 floors. She spread it on the library table and studied it with the same focused attention she gave everything that resisted immediate comprehension. The east wing was extensive, far more extensive than the locked door at the end of the portrait gallery had suggested from the outside. Whoever had drawn the map had taken care with the east wing in particular. Every room was labeled, the walls were precise, and at the far end of the wing, on the 2nd floor, a room had been marked not with a name, but with a symbol she did not immediately recognize. A small drawn circle with a single horizontal line through its center, repeated 3 times in a vertical column. She had seen the symbol before somewhere, she was certain of it, but the memory floated at the edge of her reach and would not be gathered in. She copied it carefully into her notebook. Then she replaced the estate records volume on its shelf and went to find Mr. Crewe. "I have a question," she said, when she located him in the entrance hall supervising the cleaning of a large chandelier, which required a stepladder and the combined efforts of 2 footmen who appeared to have accepted their fate with admirable calm. "I have no doubt," said Mr. Crewe, without looking down from his observation of the chandelier. "The East Wing. How many rooms does it contain?" The quality of the pause that followed told her more than any answer would have. It was not a simple pause, not the brief gap of a man retrieving information he had ready to hand. It was the pause of a man making a decision about how much territory to cede. "I am not in a position to discuss the East Wing," he said finally. "Rule 3, she said. "You can't discuss the house's history or former occupants." "But I didn't ask about history or former occupants. I asked about square footage." Mr. Crewe looked at her then, directly, for the first time since she had known him, and his expression was not the professionally empty surface she had become accustomed to reading. Beneath the composure was something that looked, remarkably, like the very early stages of amusement. It was deeply suppressed. It was almost certainly a disciplinary violation in his own internal code of conduct. But it was there. "You should ask the Duke," he said, and returned his attention to the chandelier. She found the Duke in the study he occupied on the ground floor of the West Wing, the room she had identified from a map as the estate office, although calling it merely an office was the kind of understatement that required effort. It was a large, high-ceilinged room lined on 2 walls with shelves of ledgers and correspondence files, and on the 3rd wall with a set of tall windows that looked onto the side garden where a stone fountain, drained for winter, stood at the center of a gravel path like a stop clock. He was at the desk when she knocked and entered. He had said enter before she could fully form the knock, which suggested his attention was already more diffuse than the papers before him warranted. He looked up. His expression did what it always did when he found her in a space he had not mentally prepared for her. A brief recalibration, a quick, controlled adjustment, and then the return of composure. She was beginning to understand that this recalibration was involuntary. He did not choose to be thrown by her presence. It simply happened, and he managed it immediately after, which was a distinction she found worth noting. "Miss Voss," he said. "I found a map of the house," she said, taking the chair across from his desk without being invited to sit, which she had decided on day 3 was a necessary tactical position. If she waited to be invited, she would always be waiting. "In the library. It shows the East Wing in considerable detail." The composure held. "The library contains records of the estate going back 200 years. It would be unusual if a floor plan did not exist. There is a room at the far end of the East Wing, 2nd floor, marked with a symbol rather than a name." She opened her notebook and turned it to face him, showing him the 3 times repeated circle and line. "I would like to know what that symbol indicates." He looked at the notebook. He looked at it for several seconds longer than simple recognition would require, and something happened in his face that she had not seen before, a deepening, a kind of internal weight becoming briefly visible, like a stone glimpsed through shifting water. Then it was gone. "Where did you copy that from?" he said. His voice was even, deliberately, carefully even. "The map. As I said." "I am aware the map exists," he said. "I was not aware it was accessible." "Most things are accessible," she said, "given sufficient interest." He stood then, which changed the geometry of the room in a way that required adjustment. Standing, he occupied considerably more of the available space, not aggressively, not theatrically, but simply as a matter of physical fact. He moved to the window and looked out at the stopped fountain for a moment, his back to her, and she had the strong impression of a man performing a private calculation. "You agreed to the rules," he said to the window. "I agreed to observe them. I have observed them. I have not entered the East Wing. I have not questioned the staff about the history of the house. I questioned Mr. Crewe about square footage, which is architecture rather than history, and he declined to engage regardless. So the point is moot. I have not asked you about the curse. A beat. I am asking about a symbol on a map. They are the same question. They are related questions. They are not the same question. One is a specific inquiry about a specific architectural notation. The other is a broad inquiry into the supernatural reputation of your estate. I think the distinction holds. He turned from the window. There was something new in his expression now. Not quite anger, and not quite admiration, and not quite exasperation, though it contained elements of all three in proportions she could not yet accurately measure. It was the expression, she thought, of a man who had constructed a very specific set of defenses over a very long time and had just encountered someone who was not attacking those defenses but was simply walking along their outer edges, examining their construction with unsettling expertise. You are remarkably persistent, he said. I prefer thorough, she said. Persistence implies repetition. Thoroughness implies completion. And you intend to be thorough in everything I do. He crossed to the desk and sat again, and the action had the quality of a decision, not to resume work, but to take a different kind of position in the conversation. He placed both hands flat on the surface of the desk, which he was beginning to understand was a particular gesture of his, a grounding mechanism, something done when he wanted to speak with precision. The symbol, he said, is an old notation. It appears in several places in the estate records. It marks rooms that were sealed. Sealed. As in locked. As in sealed. Structurally. The doorways were walled over. She held very still. When? 1822. 1 year after the date on Cecily Marsh's portrait. She did not say this. She filed it with exceptional care. And why were they sealed? Miss Voss. His voice had not risen. It had done something more controlled, and in some ways more effective. It had dropped, very slightly, into a register that conveyed with absolute clarity that a line had been reached. You are on the 5th day of 30. You have, by any reasonable measure, been given more latitude in this house than anyone who has come before you. I have spoken with you at greater length than I intended, in rooms I did not plan to receive you in, on subjects I had no interest in revisiting. I will tell you about the symbol. I have told you about the symbol. The room at Marks was sealed because the Duke of Ravensmore in 1822 determined that it should be sealed, and that determination has not been revisited and will not be revisited. The question of why he made that determination falls, clearly and unambiguously, under Rule 5. She regarded him for a moment. You count yourself in the third person, she observed. The Duke of Ravensmore, as though the title belongs to someone else. Something flashed through his expression, sharp, unguarded, gone in an instant. It was the quickest and most complete loss of composure she had witnessed from him, and it was over before she could fully examine it. But she had the impression, strong, intuitive, and she trusted her intuitions, that she had touched something real, something beneath the surface of the stone. The title, he said carefully, carries certain obligations. Among them, the obligation to maintain what the previous holder chose to maintain, even if you disagree with what he chose. A silence, long enough to be significant. That is not a question I choose to answer. That, she said quietly, is the most honest thing you've said to me. He looked at her across the desk with that gray, charged, winter sky expression, and for a moment the room was very still. The fountain in the garden stood in its arrested state, and the November light came through the tall windows at its flat, considered angle, and Alara felt, with the particular acuity of a person who has spent years paying close attention to things others overlook, that they were standing at the edge of something, not a conversation exactly, and not yet a feeling she had a name for, but something that was becoming more specific with every exchange, something that was taking shape the way a photograph develops. Slowly, in the dark, revealing detail that was always there, but required the right conditions to become visible. Dinner is at 7, he said at last. I know when dinner is. I thought, he said, and stopped. Then, with the quality of a man overriding his own instincts in real time, I thought, if it did not seem an unwelcome alteration to the arrangement, that we might, dine together this evening. Given that you are clearly not going to confine yourself to your rooms or the library, and given that the alternative is conducting the remainder of your 30 days as a series of unscheduled confrontations in rooms I am trying to work in. She studied him. He met her gaze with the full force of his gray attention and did not look away, and she understood that this had cost him something. This small, carefully qualified, thoroughly over-explained offer of a shared meal, and that the cost was genuine. "That would be acceptable," she said. "Thank you." 7 o'clock, he said. "The west dining room, not the east. Tell Mr. Crewe." "I will." She rose, took her notebook, and walked to the door. At the threshold she paused because she had noticed that he did this, and she was beginning to understand it as a conversational structure native to Blackthorn Hall. The pause at the threshold, the thing said at the last moment before departure, and turned back. "The symbol," she said. "The one on the map. It isn't an architectural notation, is it?" It was not quite a question. He looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said. "It isn't." She nodded, once, as though this confirmed something she had already suspected, because it did, and left the room. Behind her, in the estate office, with its stopped fountain, and its ledgers, and its tall windows letting in the abbreviated November afternoon, Adrian Ashford sat at his desk, and did not pick up his pen for a very long time. At 7 o'clock, she presented herself at the west dining room. He was already there, standing at the window, and he turned when she entered with the same involuntary recalibration she had catalogued before, and this time in the candlelight, in the room that was warmer and smaller than the east dining room, and set for two rather than one. She caught the full expression before he could manage it away. It was not what she had expected. It was not guarded. It was not disdainful. It was something quieter and more undefended than either of those things, and it lasted only the span of a single breath before composure reclaimed him. But it was there, and she had seen it, and she would think about it later in the privacy of her room with her notebook open and her pen in her hand and the moors breathing darkly outside her window. She took her seat. He took his. Between them, the candles burned with the absolute steadiness of a windless night. They began. The storm arrived without the courtesy of warning. It had been building, Ilara supposed, in the way that northern storms always built, gradually, out at the horizon, in the particular darkening of a sky that had already been dark to begin with, so that the change was registered not as a sudden shift, but as a slow intensification of something that had been present all along. By the afternoon of the 9th day, the clouds over the moors had taken on a density that felt almost structural, less like weather than like architecture. Great gray vaulted masses stacking themselves overhead with the purposeful solidity of a cathedral under construction. The wind had been rising since morning, moving through the tree-line at the estate's edge with a low, sustained tone that the house received through its stones and its old timber frames and translated into a kind of interior vibration, felt more in the body than heard with the ears. She had intended to spend the afternoon in the library. She had gathered her books, her notebook, her second candle. The library grew dim by 3 o'clock in November, even on clear days, and had made it as far as the portrait gallery when the first crack of thunder arrived, not distant and preliminary, but immediate and enormous, a sound that seemed to originate directly above the roof and roll outward in every direction simultaneously. The windows of the gallery shook in their frames. The candle flames along the walls pressed themselves sideways in the pressure wave and then recovered, burning higher for a moment before settling. Ilara stood in the gallery and listened to the rain begin. It did not build to intensity the way rain usually built. It arrived at full force immediately, like a decision that had already been made. Within 30 seconds of the first drop, it was sheeting against the gallery windows with a force that reduced the moors beyond to a moving gray curtain. The tree-line entirely swallowed, the garden wall visible only as a dim suggestion of form. She turned back toward the main house. She was halfway across the entrance hall when the lights went out. Not all of them. Blackthorn Hall was lit by a combination of gas and candlelight, and the candles in their iron sconces continued to burn, but the gas lamps that lined the main corridor extinguished simultaneously with a soft collective sound, like a held breath finally released, and the entrance hall became a different space entirely in the sudden shift to candlelight alone. Warmer, somehow. Smaller. The shadows that the gas lamps had kept at a disciplined remove moved inward, and the hall with its stone floors and its tapestried walls became something that belonged to a different century, something that had been waiting, with considerable patience, for this particular quality of light to return. She was standing in the middle of this transformation, candle in hand, making a practical assessment of her options, when Adrian Ashford came quickly down the main staircase with the focused urgency of a man responding to a known emergency, and stopped 2 steps from the bottom when he found her standing in his path. The gas lines, he said, by way of explanation, and the fact that he was explaining rather than simply moving past her told her something she filed carefully. They run underground along the east side. When the ground floods, which it does rapidly in a storm of this severity, the pressure in the lines drops. It happens every few years. Is the flooding a structural concern? No. The house is built on bedrock. The flooding is superficial. It won't reach the ground floor. But some of the exterior doors will be impassable until it recedes. He reached the bottom of the stairs. The storm will last several hours. It would not be safe to move between wings without proper lighting. She understood what he was not quite saying. We are confined to whichever wing we are currently in. To whichever part of the house has adequate candlelight, yes. He paused. The west wing has the best supply. The library, the sitting room, and the small drawing room on the ground floor are all properly stocked. Then we should go to the west wing, she said simply. He looked at her. The candlelight from her single flame was doing something to the planes of his face that the more even domestic lighting of their previous encounters had not. It was finding the angles more decisively, the shadows deeper, the overall effect more stark and more human simultaneously, as though the reduction of controlled light was producing an involuntary reduction of controlled expression to match. He looked, in this moment, less like the architect of 6 formal rules, and more like a man standing in his own house in a storm. Yes, he said, we should. They settled in the small drawing room, which was adjacent to the library, and was the kind of room that revealed itself to best advantage in exactly this kind of weather, a low-ceilinged, fireplace-centered space, with deep chairs and a sofa and bookshelves built into every available wall, and the general quality of a room that had been used, rather than maintained, over a long period of time. It was the most domestic space she had encountered in Blackthorn Hall, and that domesticity was disarming in a way she had not fully anticipated, not threatening or strange, but simply ordinary in a way that the rest of the house was not, and the ordinariness, in contrast to everything surrounding it, was somehow more unsettling than the strangeness had been. Mr. Crewe appeared with admirable promptness, delivered a tray of tea and cold supper items, bread, cheese, a covered pot of soup that steamed fragrantly, noted that the kitchen fire was secure and the staff was settled for the duration, and withdrew with the equanimity of a man for whom a storm confining the Duke of Ravensmore to a small drawing room with an unchaperoned young woman was simply another item on an evening's inventory. They sat across from each other. The fire was loud in the way that fires become loud when they are the primary sound in a room, snapping and settling, and occasionally producing a sustained hiss as something in the green would caught and released. Outside, the storm moved over the house in waves, the rain and wind building to a pitch and then easing fractionally before building again, as though testing the resistance. They ate without speaking for a while. It was not, she noticed, an uncomfortable silence. It had a different texture from the silences that had preceded their more formal exchanges. Those had been silences of positions being maintained, boundaries being monitored. This one was simply 2 people in a warm room in a storm, doing the ordinary human thing of eating, and the ordinariness of it was, she chose the word deliberately in her own mind, pleasant. It was Adrian who spoke first. You read the Wollstonecraft, he said. Not a question. He had seen her with it. Twice, since I borrowed it. Your father's annotations are extraordinary. He would have been pleased to hear that. What was he like? The question was direct. She had learned in 9 days that directness was the only approach that produced anything of value with him, that anything more oblique was recognized and managed before it could reach anything real. He looked at his cup for a moment. Principled, he said, in the way that people are principled when their principles have cost them something genuine. He read everything, because he believed understanding was the closest a person could come to decency. He annotated, because he could not encounter an idea without responding to it. A pause. He died when I was 19. I'm sorry. He had been ill for several years before the end. It was not unexpected. He said this with a particular careful evenness of someone who has had a long time to arrange this sentence, and has arranged it in a way that is honest, without being fully open. She recognized the construction. She used it herself. "My father died 3 years ago," she said. Not as an offering, exactly. More as an acknowledgement, a way of saying, "I understand what it is to have prepared and found the preparation insufficient." He was a scholar, classics and natural philosophy, though the natural philosophy was more passion than expertise. He could spend an entire afternoon attempting to explain why the sky was blue and arrive by evening at a conclusion that raised 12 new questions. Something shifted at the corner of Adrian's expression. "Did you mind?" "The questions?" "No. I loved the questions." "I minded," she stopped. Then, because they were in a storm and in candlelight and the usual architecture of caution was less available than it normally was, I minded that the questions were always more compelling to him than the answers. He never finished anything. Projects, manuscripts, conversations. He would get to the point of resolution and become interested in something else. She looked at the fire. It made it very difficult to rely on him. "But you loved him." "Completely and with very little ambivalence," which is perhaps the most honest summary of my entire interior life up to this point. He was quiet for a moment. "Then, you are not what I expected," he said. And this time it had a different quality from the first time he'd said it, less observational, more considered, as though he had been accumulating evidence for some time and had now arrived at a conclusion. "You've said that before. I find it continues to be true." He set down his cup. The fire shifted and settled, sending a brief wave of additional warmth into the room. "The women who came before you, I do not say this with any criticism of them. They were rational people making rational decisions, but they came here as one might approach a wager, with calculation, or with desperation, or with the particular ambition of a family that needed a title, and was willing to accept unusual means of acquiring one. They had, in the main, very clear ideas of what they wanted, and a very limited interest in what was actually here." "And what is actually here?" she asked. He looked at her, directly, with the full force of the winter sky gray, no deflection and no management, and she felt the quality of that regard as something almost physical, like the pressure change before lightning. "I am not certain yet," he said quietly, "but it is more than I had concluded it was." The storm outside reached a new intensity in that moment, the wind against the windows becoming a sustained roar, and they both looked toward the glass instinctively, the human response to weather that reminds you of its indifference, and then back, and the moment had shifted, though not dissipated. "Tell me about the curse," she said, not demanding, quiet, the way you might ask someone to tell you something you already know you are not entitled to, but ask for anyway, because the asking itself is a form of trust. He did not speak immediately. She had expected refusal, had prepared herself for it, had constructed the graceful acceptance of it, and instead what she got was something more complicated. He picked up his cup again, found it empty, set it down. He looked at the fire. He looked at his hands. He did so with the expression of a man who has kept something in a sealed room for a very long time, and has just been asked to describe what is inside it. "It is not a curse," he said at last, very quietly. "It never was. It is a story that a man told about himself, about this house, about a thing that happened here. And the story became fixed, the way stories do when they are not contradicted early enough. And then it became a reputation, and then it became a fact. And at a certain point the man who told the original story could no longer remember which parts were true and which parts were the story." She sat very still. "The man," she said carefully, "was that your father?" A long silence. The fire. The storm. The particular quality of a room in which something real has just been said for the first time in a long time. "No," he said. And the way he said it, the weight of it, the specific gravity of that single syllable, told her that the man was not his father, was closer than his father, was in fact the man sitting across from her in the firelight with his hands on his empty cup and his gray eyes fixed on the middle distance, holding something enormous at a careful remove from the surface of his expression. It was the most unguarded moment she had seen from him. It lasted perhaps 4 seconds before he recovered, drew himself back, straightened incrementally, reclaim composure with the particular efficiency of someone who has had years of practice. But those 4 seconds were complete and unambiguous, and she would not forget them. She did not press further. She understood, with the instinct of a person who has navigated people more carefully than she has navigated anything else in her life, that pressing further now would close something that had just, for the first time, opened. She reached instead for the bread and the cheese and said, in a tone that belonged entirely to the domestic and ordinary, "Tell me about the gardens. The geometric section, east of the fountain. Was that your design or an older one?" He looked at her. Something moved in his expression that she had no word for, something that was surprise and relief, and the specific sensation of having braced for impact, and found instead a hand extended in steadiness. It lasted a moment. Then he said, with the first complete and undefended naturalness she had heard from him, "My grandfather's. He was obsessed with formal French design. My father hated it. He said it looked like a diagram of certainty, which was the one thing the Moors had no patience for." She laughed. Not politely, actually laughed, the real thing, the involuntary one. And the sound of it in the small room was startling to both of them. She could see that, and she felt the color come into her face and did not look away. He did not look away, either. They talked for 3 more hours. The storm did not abate. The candles burned lower. At some point Mr. Crewe appeared briefly to add wood to the fire and remove the supper tray, and withdrew again without editorial comment. At some point Alara drew her feet up beneath her in the chair, which was not technically proper, and Adrian did not comment on it. At some point the conversation moved from the gardens to natural philosophy to the question of whether landscape shapes character or character shapes the perception of landscape, and they disagreed, clearly, directly, with genuine investment, and neither of them yielded, and neither of them required the other to. It was, she thought, the best conversation she had had in years. It was, she would write later in her notebook, the most dangerous evening she had yet spent in Blackthorn Hall. Not because of the storm, not because of the cursed house, or the locked east wing, or the symbol on the map, or Cecily Marsh's dark eyes watching from the portrait gallery, but because somewhere between the soup and the natural philosophy and the moment when he had said no with that specific gravity, she had made the mistake of seeing him clearly, and the far greater mistake of finding what she saw not frightening, not pitiable, not strange, but deeply, inconveniently, irrevocably interesting. The storm released them just before midnight. They walked separately to their respective wings, him west, her east, through the restored candlelight of a house that had survived, as it always survived, whatever the weather brought. At the foot of the staircase, without looking at her, he said, "Good night, Miss Voss." "Good night, Your Grace," she said. She climbed the stairs. At the top, she turned once, from habit or instinct or something she declined to name, and looked down. He was still standing at the foot of the staircase, looking up. Neither of them spoke. Then he turned and walked toward the west wing, and she turned and walked toward her room, and the house held the silence of after storm between them like something cupped carefully in 2 hands, fragile, present, and not yet fully understood. She did not plan it. That was the truth she returned to afterward, when she tried to construct an honest account of what had happened. She had not gone to the east wing with intention. She had gone looking for something else entirely. It was the 14th day. The morning had been clear by Blackthorn Hall standards, which meant that the cloud cover had thinned to something merely gray rather than substantially gray, and the light reaching the rear gardens had enough warmth in it to suggest that the sun existed somewhere behind it, pressing patiently against the wool of the sky. She had walked the gardens after breakfast, as she had fallen into the habit of doing, following the geometric paths her through the bare-boned formality of the Duke's grandfather's French design. She had her notebook. She had not been thinking about the East Wing. She had been thinking about dinner the previous evening, which had become, over the course of the 14 days, the part of the day she found herself anticipating with a frankness she did not entirely trust. They dined together every night now, the west dining room, the 2 of them at either end of a table proportioned for 12. Which they had resolved by mutual unspoken agreement to move to the small end near the fire, sitting perpendicular to each other rather than facing across an expanse of mahogany that made conversation feel like diplomacy. They talked about everything except the things they did not talk about, and the things they did not talk about had become, by accumulation and proximity, the largest presence in the room. The night before, he had said something she was still turning over. They had been discussing, of all things, the question of whether a person could choose to stop being afraid of something, or whether fear was entirely involuntary, a bodily fact as unalterable as height. She had argued for the possibility of choice. He had listened, and then he had said very quietly, as though speaking primarily to himself, "There are things I am afraid of that I chose. I chose to be afraid of them because the alternative was something I did not know how to survive." She had not pressed him on it. She was learning, with the slow and effortful precision of someone learning a new language in full immersion, when to press and when to simply receive. This was a time for receiving. But she had thought about it afterward, lying awake in her green-curtained room with the moors breathing outside, and she was still thinking about it when she came in from the gardens, and, instead of turning left toward the portrait gallery and then the library, turned right. The east wing door was at the end of a secondary corridor she had identified on the map but not previously explored. It branched off the main passage near the base of the east staircase, and had the quality of all deliberately unused spaces, a slight dimness, a cooler temperature, the particular silence of a place that has not been required to absorb any sound in a long time. The door itself was large, dark oak, iron-banded in the old style, with a lock that appeared, on first examination, to be substantial. On second examination, the lock was not engaged. She stood before it for exactly the amount of time it took to have the following interior exchange. This is Rule 1. I know it is. The lock is not engaged. The lock being unengaged is not an invitation. It is also not a prohibition beyond the one already stated in writing. I have been in this house for 14 days. I have respected every material constraint. This is Rule 1. She pushed open the door. The east wing opened before her like a sentence that had been holding its breath. It was not ruined. She had half expected ruin, the romantic decay of Gothic imagination, crumbling plaster and boards gone soft with damp. Instead, the corridor was simply stopped. That was the only word for it. Everything was as it had been, she intuited, on some specific day in the past, when someone had walked out and not returned, dust-sheeted furniture visible through open doorways, a runner carpet on the corridor floor, still intact though faded, pictures on the walls, still straight, but stopped, preserved in a kind of enforced stasis that was more disturbing, somehow, than destruction would have been. Destruction implied that time had been allowed to do its ordinary work. This implied that time had been refused entry. She moved slowly, not touching. The rooms off the main corridor were sitting rooms and a music room. She identified the latter by the shape of the sheeted form in the corner, which was unmistakably a pianoforte beneath its cover, and by the sheeted form beside it, which was a harp. Both were covered with a care that suggested they had been prepared for storage rather than abandoned. Someone had meant to come back for them. Someone had decided, later, not to. The staircase at the end of the corridor brought her to the second floor of the east wing, where the map had placed the sealed room. But she was not looking for the sealed room. She had forgotten, momentarily, the sealed room, because she had found instead, at the top of the staircase, a door that stood half open to a room that was unlike the others. This room had not been sheeted. The furniture was uncovered, a writing desk, a chair, a small daybed against the wall, and on the writing desk, visible from the doorway, was a stack of papers held in place by a small glass paperweight that caught the thin gray light from the window and scattered it across the surface in points. She went in. The papers were letters. Not a stack of correspondence in the ordinary sense, not an organized collection. They had the disorder of things that have been read many times and not always replaced with care, some folded, some half open, the handwriting varying between them in ways that suggested multiple authors, over what appeared to be a significant span of time. She did not read them. She was conscious, with precise clarity, of the distinction between entering a room she had been told to avoid and reading another person's private correspondence, and she would not cross the second line even having crossed the first. She did not read them, but the topmost letter, partly unfolded, lying as though it had been most recently set down, had 3 lines visible at its opening that she could not avoid seeing without deliberately closing her eyes, and she did not close her eyes. and so she saw. "I know what they will say of you when I am gone, and I want you to know that none of it was your fault. Not the breaking of it. Not the ending. What happened was mine, and you were kinder than you knew. And I am sorry I did not say, so while there was still time to mean it." The handwriting was a woman's. The signature was obscured by the fold of the paper, but the date at the top was visible. March 1822. 1 month after Cecily Marsh's portrait. She was still standing at the desk with the March 1822 letter in her peripheral vision, working through the implications with the focused attention of someone doing arithmetic with very large numbers, when she heard the floorboard behind her. She did not need to turn to know who it was. She had learned in 14 days the particular quality of the silence that preceded him in a room, the way the air in a space seemed to acquire a different density in the moment before he entered it, as though his attention arrived slightly ahead of his person. She turned. He was in the doorway. He had come without a lamp, which meant he had come quickly, had been told, or had heard, or had known through some instinct particular to a man who has spent years monitoring the perimeter of a place he was trying to keep intact. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen from him before, and it required, for the first time in their 14 days of careful mutual observation, more than a single word to describe. There was fury in it. That was the topmost layer, the one she met first, a cold, controlled fury of the kind that does not shout because it has decided shouting is insufficient, and has opted instead for the far more formidable quality of absolute stillness. But beneath the fury was grief. Not fresh grief, not the raw, undone grief of immediate loss. Something older and more integrated than that, the kind of grief that has been lived with so long it has become structural, a load-bearing element of the architecture of a person without which the whole construction might fail. And beneath the grief, barely visible and perhaps not meant to be visible at all, was something else, something that was neither fury nor grief, but was afraid. Not of her, not of the letter, of what her presence here in this stopped and preserved room meant for the wall he had built around it. She did not look at the letter. She looked at him. "I haven't read them," she said. Her voice was steady. She kept it steady with effort, because the expression on his face was doing something to her chest that she did not have a clinical name for. "I saw the date. I couldn't help that. But I haven't read them." He said nothing. The fury was doing what it always did in his face, the controlled management of it, the disciplined application of composure over the top of it. But the grief was slower. The grief was not yet managed. "You need to leave this room," he said. His voice was very quiet, quieter than she had ever heard it. The quietness was its own kind of warning. "I know," she said. "I'm sorry." She walked to the door. He did not step aside immediately. He stood in the frame for a moment too long, and she came close enough to him that she could see the exact quality of the tension in his jaw, the precise effort the composure was costing him, and she understood with sudden and complete clarity that the East Wing had not been sealed to keep strangers out. It had been sealed to keep him from having to be in it. He stepped aside. She walked past him. In the corridor, she stopped her back to him, because she could not yet turn and look at the expression she had just seen and be certain of saying nothing more than she meant to. The letter was hers, she said, not a question. Cecily Marsh's. The silence behind her had the quality of something cracking, a sound you don't hear so much as feel through the soles of your feet. "Go back to the main house," he said. She went. Behind her, in the doorway of the unsheeted room, the Duke of Ravensmore stood with his hand on the door frame and looked at the desk where the letter lay, and the March light came through the old glass of the window and fell across the paperweight and scattered into points of cold illumination, and the East Wing was completely, entirely silent, and he did not move for a very long time. He found her in the library at 4:30. She had gone there directly from the East Wing, the way one goes to a familiar place when the unfamiliar has become too immediate, not to hide, not to recover, but to be somewhere that had the quality of a position. Known, chosen, stable. She had taken a chair by the window and opened her notebook, but had not written anything. The pen lay across the page. The moors beyond the glass were doing what they did in the late afternoon, deepening incrementally, through shades of gray that a more romantic cast of mind might have found oppressive, and that she found, at this particular moment, genuinely soothing in their indifference. She heard him on the staircase before she saw him. His tread on the iron spiral was distinctive. She had memorized it, she realized, without intending to, the way one memorizes the sound of a particular door or a particular clock in a house one has occupied long enough. He came around the lower shelves and stopped when he found her at the window, and she looked up from the open page of nothing she had been not writing in, and they regarded each other across the circular room with the particular wariness of two people who have just shown each other something they were not prepared to show. He had a lamp. He had come prepared this time, and the lamp in his hand cast its warm circle of light over the lower shelves and illuminated the near half of his face, leaving the rest in the sliding shadow of the November afternoon. He looked, not at peace exactly, but resolved. The fury she had seen in the East Wing was gone, or had been taken somewhere private where it could be managed more thoroughly than a doorway permitted. What had replaced it was something more deliberate, the expression of a man who had made a decision in the 2 hours since she had walked away from the East Wing corridor, and was now arriving to implement it. He crossed to the chair across from hers and sat without invitation, which was the first time he had done so, and she noted this with the careful, lateral attention she gave to everything in this house. He set the lamp on the side table. He looked at the unwritten page of her notebook for a moment, then at her face. Her name, he said, was Cecily Marsh. She was 23 years old. She came to Blackthorn Hall in the autumn of 1821 as my father's ward, and she was the most genuinely good person I have ever known, and I was 21 years old and entirely certain I understood what that meant, and I did not. Alara closed her notebook. She set it on the table beside the lamp. She folded her hands in her lap and said nothing, because she understood, with the complete and precise understanding of a person who has spent this many days learning the specific grammar of this particular man, that the thing required here was not a question. The thing required was to remain absolutely still and let him speak at whatever pace the speaking required, and to receive what came without editorial addition, because the slightest interruption might close the door she had, at considerable personal cost to Rule 1, managed to push open. He spoke, not with the careful, managed pace of his usual speech, the deliberate precision of a man who selects each word from a vetted list of those that reveal nothing he does not intend to reveal. He spoke with the different quality of someone who has been holding a specific monologue alone for years and is finally delivering it to an audience, and the primary effect of that audience is not pressure but release, and the release, once begun, has its own momentum. Cecily Marsh had been the daughter of a clergyman in the West Riding, a man of some learning and no money, who had died when Cecily was 17 and left her, through a connection of old friendship, in the guardianship of Adrian's father, the previous duke. She had come to Blackthorn Hall with 2 trunks and a remarkable capacity for unsentimental observation. She had looked at the house on her first evening, Adrian told Alara, and said, "It is the most honest building I have ever seen. It does not pretend to be cheerful." And his father had laughed for the first time in months. She had been, in the years that followed, the closest thing to ease that Blackthorn Hall had ever contained. She had a gift for ordinary happiness that was not the forced brightness of someone performing contentment, but the genuine daily satisfaction of a person for whom the world's available pleasures, a fire, a book, a view, a good argument, were fully sufficient to account for. She read everything in the library. She and Adrian's father had talked for hours over the estate accounts. She and Adrian had argued regularly and with vigor about everything from moral philosophy to the proper method of making tea, and he had. He said this with the particular flatness of a man describing a past state so familiar it had become invisible. Loved her. Not romantically, not initially, not even consciously. He had simply loved her in the way one loves what is most necessary, with the taken-for-granted reliability of breathing. In 1820, he had asked her to marry him. She had said no. He recounted this fact with the economy of long practice, not because it no longer held weight, but because it held so much weight that brevity was the only structure that could carry it without collapse. She had said no, kindly and completely, and had given him her reasons with the same clarity she gave everything. And the reasons had been that she did not love him in the way a wife ought to love a husband, that she valued what they were too precisely to ask it to become something it was not, and that she believed, as firmly as she believed anything, that a marriage built on one person's love and another person's affection, however genuine, was a foundation that would crack under the first real weight. He had received this badly. He said this without euphemism, which she respected. He had received it badly, not with anger, but with the particular cold withdrawal of a young man who has been hurt too deeply for the hurt to show on the surface, and has responded by relocating himself to a place inside where nothing further can reach him. He had become, in the months that followed, the version of himself that she recognized from his rules and his notices and the measured distance of their early conversations. Deliberate, self-contained, armored with composure, and deploying it against everything that approached. Cecily had watched this. She had tried, with the honest directness that was her essential quality, to reach through it. He had not let her. In the spring of 1822, she had become ill. It was a fever, ordinary in its origins, swift and catastrophic in its progress, the way fevers were in those years before there was anything adequate to stand between a person and the momentum of a determined infection. She was sick for 3 weeks. In the 3rd week, she had asked to see him. He had not gone. He said this. He said it directly, without the protection of elaboration or context. And the saying of it in the circular library with the November afternoon going dark outside and the lamp between them was the most complete act of honesty she had witnessed from another person in a very long time. He had not gone. He had told himself he would go tomorrow. He had told himself that she was not as ill as they were saying. He had told himself that to go was to admit something he was not yet prepared to admit. He had constructed, with a considerable intelligence at his disposal, every possible reason for delay, and by the time he had dismantled them all and gone to her door, she was already gone. He had found the letter 3 days later, written in the last week of her illness, to him, addressed to him by name, left with a household maid with instructions that he should receive it. He had read it. He had read it many times, he said, and each reading had given him something new to carry, not the diminishing return of repeated exposure, but the opposite. The way a text reveals more of itself, the more fully one comes to understand what it requires of the reader. What the letter said was, it was not his fault. That was the core of it. She had written it knowing what stories would circulate, knowing that the rejected proposal, the withdrawal, the not going would be assembled into a narrative by people with insufficient information and considerable appetite for significance. She had written to contradict that narrative preemptively, with the authority of the person most qualified to assess the truth of it. None of it was his fault. He had been young. He had been hurt. He had behaved as hurt young men behave when they lack the tools to do otherwise. She forgave him entirely, and had, in fact, nothing to forgive him for, because grief was not a moral failure, and withdrawal was not cruelty, and being unable to go to a door was not the same as not loving the person behind it. He had not believed her. He had sealed the East Wing. He had sent away the staff who had been there in those years. He had taken the portrait that his father had commissioned of Cecily, painted in 1821, in the green dress she had worn at Christmas, with the note he had watched her write at the sitting-room desk folded in her hand, and he had hung it in the portrait gallery, where it could not be avoided and where he could not pretend it had not happened. And he had, over the course of the years that followed, constructed a reputation for himself and his house, so effectively that the world's intrusion had been reduced to a manageable level, and the manageable level had felt, from the inside, like safety, and he had confused it for safety for nearly a decade, until, presumably, it had stopped working. Until the notice in the Gazette. He fell silent. The lamp between them burned with the steadiness of a windless room, and the library held the silence the way good rooms hold silence, not empty, but full, containing what had been said and giving it the space it required. Alara looked at him. He was not looking at her. His gaze was on the mid-distance, on the middle of the space between them, on whatever internal landscape a person inhabits when they have just said everything they were not saying. He looked, she thought, lighter. Not happy. Lightness was not happiness, and she was not going to mistake one for the other, but lighter, as though something that had been distributed across his body as weight had been set, temporarily, on the table between them to be examined in better light. The notice, she said carefully. The dare. was that an act of desperation dressed as eccentricity, he said. He looked at her then. I had decided that if I was going to be trapped in the story, the cursed duke, the haunted house, the broken engagement, then I might as well make the story do something. I thought, he stopped, looked away again. I thought that if someone came and stayed and left as the others had, I would at least have the clarity of confirmed isolation. That there was no version of this house that was inhabitable by anyone but me. That the story was, in fact, the truth. And if someone stayed? The question sat in the room, between them. He did not answer it immediately. Outside, the moors had gone entirely dark, and the lamplight was now the whole of the available world in the circular library, warm and bounded and complete. I had not believed anyone would stay, he said quietly. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back. And the thing that had been becoming more specific with every exchange, the thing that was taking shape in the dark like a photograph developing, all that accumulated detail emerging from a long exposure, was now in the lamplight, in the silence, after everything he had said, visible. Fully visible. Not the suggestion of it, not the edge of it caught in peripheral vision and carefully not examined. The thing itself, present, legible, and too large for either of them to manage back into the shadows where it had been living. She was the first to speak. She was right, Ilara said, about it not being your fault. I've read enough of the world's accounting of human behavior to know that 21 is very young to understand what you have, and that grief wears the face of every other feeling until you have enough experience to tell them apart. She knew that. She wrote the letter because she knew that. He said nothing. You don't have to believe me, she said. You've had 10 years of not believing her, and she knew you considerably better than I do. But I am telling you what I see, which is that the story you've been living in is not the one she wrote. He looked at her, and for the second time in their acquaintance, she saw the full expression before he could manage it away. But this time it lasted longer. This time, the management did not come quickly. This time he simply looked at her with everything visible, the grief and the relief, and the specific terrifying quality of being seen clearly by another person for the first time in a very long time. And he did not look away. Neither did she. 14 days, he said at last, very quietly. 16 remaining, she said. He nodded, once slowly, as though the arithmetic of it contained something he needed a moment to accommodate. Then he picked up the lamp, rose from his chair, and offered her his hand to rise, which he had never done before, and which was, in the grammar of Blackthorn Hall, a sentence she had not expected to encounter. She took it. His hand was warm. She had not expected that either. They went to dinner. The letter arrived on the morning of the 20th day, which was the 13th from what Ilara, in the private accounting of her notebook, had begun to call the evening the library changed. It arrived in the ordinary post, addressed to her in a hand she had not seen for 8 months, and had not, in the pressure of Blackthorn Hall's daily particular demands on her attention, thought about as often as she probably should have. Mr. Crewe brought it to the breakfast room on a salver, as he brought all her correspondence, with the neutral expression of a man who has sorted and delivered mail for 30 years and has achieved a philosophical equipoise about its contents. Ilara looked at the handwriting on the envelope. She set down her cup. She did not open it immediately. Mr. Crewe withdrew. She opened it. Gerald Fitch wrote in the way he did everything, with a compressed urgency of a man who had decided that his requirements were the primary organizing fact of any situation. The letter was short. It was not technically threatening. It was the kind of letter that a careful reader, a magistrate, say, or a solicitor reviewing it for actionable content, would find entirely within the bounds of ordinary correspondence. But Ilara was not a careful reader in the technical legal sense. She was a precise reader, and she read the letter with the precision it deserved, and what she read was this. He had found out where she was. He had known for some days. He was, as of the writing of this letter, making arrangements to come to Yorkshire. He wished to discuss the matter of her departure and the matter of certain documents she had in her possession, and he trusted she would receive him with the cooperative spirit appropriate to someone who understood the nature of their situation. Cooperative spirit. She folded the letter. She placed it in her pocket. She looked at her teacup for a long moment, then at the window, where the rear gardens were receiving the morning light with their usual gray composure, and she thought, with the focus of a person who has arrived at the exact junction she has been navigating toward and away from in alternating motion for 20 days, about what came next. Gerald Fitch was not a violent man. She wanted to be precise about this, because imprecision here would lead to either overreaction or underpreparation, and she could afford neither. He was not violent. He was the kind of man who was dangerous in proportion to his cleverness, and he was clever enough, not brilliantly, not originally, but with the practical, applied cleverness of someone who understood leverage and had no compunction about applying it. She had known him for 2 years and had spent the better part of one of those years disentangling herself from a situation that had begun as straightforward employment and had become something considerably less straightforward when she had discovered, in the course of that employment, something Gerald Fitch had not intended her to find. The documents. She had not stolen them. She wanted to be precise about that as well, because the word mattered. She had copied them, made careful, accurate transcriptions of 3 letters, and a set of accounts that constituted, collectively, evidence that Gerald Fitch had been systematically defrauding the estate of an elderly widow in his capacity as her financial manager. She had copied them because she had not known what else to do with what she had found, and because she was not a person who could unknow things, and because the widow had a daughter and 2 granddaughters who were depending on the estate's income without any knowledge that the income was being redirected. Fitch had discovered the copies were missing. He had come to certain correct conclusions about who had made them. He had been, since then, looking for her with the focused application of a man who understands that a particular document in a particular set of hands represents a particular category of problem, and who has resolved to solve the problem before it becomes unsolvable. This was why she had come to Blackthorn Hall. Not because of the notice itself, not for the same reason the titled ladies had been tempted or repelled. She had come because Blackthorn Hall was remote, reputationally impenetrable, and governed by a man so thoroughly established as reclusive that no visitor, announced or otherwise, could arrive at its gates without considerable advanced knowledge and considerable social justification. She had come, in short, to disappear inside a story so large it would swallow her small one. She had not planned to stay beyond what was necessary. She had not planned to dine with him every evening. She had not planned the storm or the library or the east wing or the way he had handed her out of her chair in the lamplight of the 14th evening. She had not planned any of it. And now she was standing in the ruins of her original plan with Gerald Fitch riding toward Yorkshire in one direction and the truth riding toward the surface in another. And she had 10 days remaining and a choice that she had known, with the back of her mind that she had been keeping carefully quiet, was coming. She spent the morning working through it. Not in her notebook. The notebook was honest but limited, useful for the recording of observations, but insufficient for the weighing of them against each other when the weights were this unevenly distributed. She walked instead, the rear gardens, twice around the geometric paths, then out beyond the garden wall to where the grounds gave way to the rougher terrain, before the more proper, far enough to be cold, close enough to the house that she could still see the east wing windows from where she stood. The east wing windows, sheeted rooms inside, a stopped pianoforte, a letter in a dead woman's hand that said it was not his fault. She had 2 options, and she counted them with the same honesty she applied to everything else. Option 1, she said nothing. She managed Fitch's arrival from within the structure of the dare. She was under the Duke's protection, technically, for the duration of the 30 days, and his arrival would require the Duke's cooperation to access her. She used the remaining 10 days to somehow, without explaining her reasons, convince Adrian Ashford to refuse Fitch admittance. And she left on the 30th morning with whatever was between them intact and her secret buried beneath it, and she dealt with Fitch afterward, alone, as she had been dealing with him for 8 months. The problem with option 1 was that it required her to deceive him. Not by action. She had committed no action against him, had done nothing in 20 days that was not genuinely what it appeared to be, but by omission, by continuing to allow him to understand her presence here as freely chosen when the full account of it was more complicated, by letting him believe she had come to Blackthorn Hall for the dare, when the dare had been, at the beginning, a vehicle. She stood at the edge of the moors and thought about his face when he had said, "The letter was in the door of the east wing." She thought about 14 days of dinners. She thought about the question of whether fear was chosen. She thought about his hand, warm, offering her a way to rise. Option 2 was the only option. She was aware, with the precision of someone who has committed to an honest assessment of a painful situation, that it might cost her everything. He had spent 10 years becoming a man who did not trust easily, and the currency of his trust was exactly the thing she was about to tell him she had, initially, failed to earn. The connection between deception and betrayal was not, in his case, a theoretical one. He had lived inside a story that had distorted into something unrecognizable, and the distortion had cost him a decade. She was about to tell him that she had added a dimension to her own story that he had not been given. He might not forgive it. She came in from the cold at noon and asked Mr. Crewe to tell the Duke she wished to speak with him at his convenience, if he had time before dinner. Mr. Crewe said he would convey the message. She went to her room and took the documents from where she had kept them for 8 months, folded inside the back cover of her second notebook, wrapped in oilcloth against damp, and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at them. The transcriptions were in her handwriting, clear and careful, every numeral correct. She had been thorough. She had been thorough because the widow's daughter was named Margaret, and the 2 granddaughters were 7 and 4 years old, and their lives would be affected by the accuracy of this accounting. She put the documents in her pocket. She went to the estate office. He was there. He looked up when she entered, and the look he gave her was the one that had become, in the past week, a different quality from all the ones preceding it. No recalibration, no managed adjustment. Simply recognition. The particular way a person looks at someone whose presence in a room has ceased to require accommodation because it has become simply one of the room's conditions. It was, she thought, the most frightening look she had ever received. "Sit down," she said, and then stopped because that was not right. This was his office and his house, and she was the one with the confession. "I'm sorry. May I sit?" Something in her tone reached him. He set his pen down. "Yes," he said. "What has happened?" She sat. She put the letter from Gerald Fitch on the desk in front of him, and beside it, the folded oilcloth containing the documents. She placed her hands in her lap. She looked at him directly, the way she looked at everything she needed to understand. "I need to tell you," she said, "who I actually am and why I actually came here. And I need to tell you before someone else arrives and tells you a version of it that I cannot control." He looked at the letter. He looked at the oilcloth. He looked at her face. "Then tell me," he said. She did. She told him everything. Not the edited version. Not the version she might have constructed with more time and less urgency, in which the sequence was better arranged and the less flattering elements were subordinated to context that softened them. She told him the full account in the order in which it had happened, because any other order would have required her to make choices about what to reveal when, and she did not trust herself to make those choices without the choosing itself becoming a form of management, and she was done with management where he was concerned. She told him about Gerald Fitch and the widow's estate. She told him about the documents and what they contained. She told him that she had copied them and kept them because she had not known what else to do, and because she could not unknow what she had found. She told him that Fitch had discovered the copies were missing and had been searching for her since, and that the moors of Yorkshire and the impenetrable reputation of Blackthorn Hall had seemed, to a woman with very limited options, like the most solid available ground. She told him that the notice in the Gazette had been, in the beginning, a vehicle, a structure to inhabit while she worked out what to do next. She told him this directly, without the softening addition she might have reached for, which was that it had become something else, that the beginning was not the sum of it, because that softening, however true, was also self-serving, and he deserved the unself-serving version first. She placed the documents on his desk. She told him what they were. She told him that if he had any connection to the legal structures that could bring their contents to the attention of the appropriate parties, she would be grateful, because she had been carrying them for 8 months, and had not yet found a path from evidence to consequence that did not require more legal standing than she possessed. Then she stopped. He had not moved during the telling. He had sat with both hands on the desk, that grounding gesture she had catalogued, and had looked at her with an expression she could not read, which was unusual. In 21 days she had developed, she believed, a reasonable fluency with his expressions. This one was new, or was a configuration of familiar elements in an unfamiliar combination, and she could not parse it, and the inability to parse it was its own species of fear. The silence after she finished was long, not the productive silence of someone assembling a response. A different kind, the silence of someone sitting with what they have just been given and determining, before speaking, what they actually feel about it. She had learned to respect his silences. She respected this one. She sat very still and waited and did not perform composure, because performance would have been its own insult at this particular moment. When he spoke, his voice was level, specifically, carefully level, the kind of levelness that costs something to maintain. "You came here to hide," he said. "Initially," she said. "Yes. You answered the notice in my name as a means of securing a location Fitch could not easily access. That was my primary calculation, yes." At the start. A pause. "And the dinners? The library?" He stopped. His jaw tightened, fractionally, the smallest visible movement of a large internal adjustment. Was any of it, was the interest genuine? Or was that also calculation? It was the question she had known was coming and had prepared for, and the preparation had consisted, entirely, of deciding to answer it without calculation. "The interest was genuine from the first week," she said. "The conversation was genuine. Everything I said to you was the truth of what I thought and felt in the moment of saying it. I was hiding from Fitch. I was not hiding from you. The distinction," he said, "may not be as clear as you intend it." "I know," she said. "I'm not asking you to find it clear. I'm asking you to know that it exists." Another silence. He looked at the documents on his desk. He looked at Fitch's letter. He looked at his hands flat on the surface. And something moved in his face that she could see only because she had spent 21 days learning to see it. A quality of hurt, quickly contained. Not the old grief. Something newer and sharper, with the specific quality of a thing felt recently rather than a thing carried long. "I need some time," he said. "Of course. I will have Mr. Crewe send a message that you are not to be disturbed by anyone arriving at the gate. That is, regardless of anything else, that is something I can do. Fitch will not reach you here." She had not expected this, not the speed of it, not the clean separation of his personal response from his practical one. "Thank you," she said quietly. He nodded. He looked at the window. She rose, because the conversation had reached its natural end, and remaining past it would have been its own imposition, and she walked to the door. At the threshold, she paused, the Blackthorn Hall instinct, the threshold pause, the thing said at the last moment, and then decided against it. She had said everything she had to say. The pause was for the person who still had something to add. She had nothing to add. She left. The hall grew colder. It was not, she decided later, a supernatural coldness. It was the coldness of a house from which warmth has been partially withdrawn. The way a room feels when someone who occupied it has left and taken something with them that had not been identified as a source of warmth until its absence made the subtraction measurable. He did not come to dinner. She ate alone in the east dining room for the first time in nearly 2 weeks, and the room, which he had barely thought about since the third day, felt enormous again. Mr. Crewe told her the following morning, with careful neutrality, that the Duke was engaged with estate matters and would be working through his meals for the coming days. She thanked him. She did not ask for how many days. She went to the library. She read. She walked. She wrote in her notebook with the diligence of someone giving their hand something to do, because the alternative was to sit with nothing between herself and the knowledge of what she had set in motion. She wrote about Cecily Marsh. She wrote about the frozen rooms of the East Wing and the note in the dead woman's hand. She wrote about the way he had said, "I had not believed anyone would stay," and the way he had looked when she had taken his hand. She did not write about what she felt. She was precise about this omission. What she felt was her own, and it was also irrelevant in the strict sense, because what she felt could not be offered as an argument for anything. It could not undo the deception. It could not accelerate the process he was moving through, which was one she recognized. The process of determining whether the thing discovered changes the meaning of what preceded it, or whether the thing preceded is substantial enough to survive the discovery and mean the same thing after. She did not know what he would decide. On the third day of silence, she passed him in the portrait gallery at mid-morning. Him coming, her going, the narrow space between the portraits requiring them to acknowledge each other. He looked at her. She looked at him. He said, "Good morning, Miss Voss." Not with coldness, not with warmth. With the careful, specific distance of a man who is in the middle of something and has not yet finished it. "Good morning, Your Grace," she said. They passed. She continued to the library. He continued wherever he was going. She did not turn to watch him go, because she had already made the decision. In the estate office on the day of the telling, somewhere in the interval between sitting down and opening her mouth, not to position herself as someone waiting for a verdict. She had made her account. The account was complete. Whatever came next was his to determine, and she would wait for the determination without performing the waiting. On the fifth day of silence, Polly brought her tea in the library unbidden, set it on the reading table with the particular care of someone delivering something that is meant to say more than the thing itself, and said, "Cook made the shortbread, miss. The kind with the orange peel. It's the Duke's recipe." Alara looked at the plate of shortbread. She looked at Polly, whose round face was carefully expressionless in the manner of a 17-year-old attempting professional discretion for the first time. "Thank him," Alara said, "if you see him." Polly said she would, and left with the speed of someone who has delivered a message and does not wish to be present for the reply. Alara ate a piece of shortbread. It was excellent. It was, she thought, the most complicated biscuit she had ever consumed, layered with more context than shortbread had any business containing, orange-scented and butter-rich, and almost unbearable in the way that small, precise kindnesses can be unbearable when they arrive in the middle of uncertainty. She had 9 days remaining. She began with the practical attention of someone who understands that preparation and hope are not mutually exclusive. To pack. Not all of it, not her books, not her notebook, not the small things that had migrated over 20-some days into the natural arrangements of a space one has made genuinely one's own. But the traveling trunk came down from the top of the wardrobe, and she put into it, carefully and without drama, the thing she could most easily be without. It was, she told herself, not pessimism. It was the acknowledgement that the 30th morning would arrive regardless of what happened between now and then, and she was not going to be the woman who was caught unprepared for her own departure. The green curtains of her room moved in the draft from the window she had left ajar despite the cold, and the moors beyond the glass were doing their usual enormous thing, unconcerned with the particular drama contained in the stone rooms beneath this specific October sky, and Alara sat on the edge of the bed beside her half-packed trunk and permitted herself, for exactly the length of time it took to breathe in and breathe out twice, to feel the full weight of what the next 9 days might, or might not contain. Then she closed the trunk, left it where it was, and went down to dinner. She ate alone again, but the shortbread was on the table. On the 29th night, she did not sleep. This was not, she told herself, a dramatic statement. It was a practical description of how the night went. She lay in the four-poster bed, beneath the green curtains, with her eyes at varying degrees of open or closed, and her mind conducting the particular relentless review that comes when a significant threshold is approaching and the mind has decided that sleep is a luxury it cannot justify. She reviewed, with the thoroughness she applied to everything, the 30 days in their sequence, from the iron gate and the gravel drive and the man in the doorway who had said you were smaller than I expected, through the rules and the library and the storm and the east wing and the dinner tables and the lamplight and the letter and the telling and the silence and the shortbread, all of it in order, at the pace each memory required. At 4 in the morning she rose. She dressed in the dark with the efficiency of someone who has dressed herself without a maid for 4 years and can do so in any lighting condition. Then looked at the traveling trunk at the end of the bed. She had finished packing it 2 days ago. Everything was inside it except for what she was wearing, and the notebook which she tucked under her arm, and the gray hat with the felt ribbon, which she had decided on the first morning was the appropriate hat for arrivals that required the appearance of dignity, and had now decided was the appropriate hat for departures of the same category. She put on the gray hat. The decision to leave before the official 30th morning, before he was awake, before Mr. Crewe was managing the household in his usual pre-breakfast manner, before anyone could witness the leaving, had come to her not suddenly, but by accumulation, the way most honest decisions come, gradually, through the quiet elimination of alternatives. She would not make him watch her go. She would not stand at the gate in the morning light while he stood on the steps performing whatever was appropriate to the end of a failed dare. The dare had not been what either of them had come to call it, privately or otherwise, and its formal conclusion felt, in this particular case, like the wrong ending to the wrong story. Better to go quietly. Better to leave the house to its own mourning without asking it to contain her departure as well. She had written a letter. It was on the writing desk, sealed, addressed to him by name in her own hand. The first time she had written his name in full, she realized as she wrote it, rather than the title that had stood in for the person throughout. She had written it the previous evening and read it over once and found it adequate. It did not say what she felt. Feelings were not evidence, and this was not a legal brief. It said what she had observed, over 30 days, to be true, that the house was not what the story had made it, and neither was he, and the women who had left before her had left for reasons that had nothing to do with curses and everything to do with the fact that they had not been looking for what was actually here. She had been looking for safety. She had found something else. She was glad she had found it, and she was sorry for the manner of the finding, and she hoped, when the 30th morning resolved itself into the 31st and the 32nd and so on, that the resolution involved more light than it had in the past decade. She picked up the traveling trunk. She took one last look at the green curtains and the writing desk and the window where the Moors were doing their pre-dawn thing, dark, enormous, not asking anything of anyone. She went downstairs. The entrance hall was dark. The candles in the iron sconces had burned to stubs hours ago and had not been replaced, and the only light was the blue-gray pre-dawn quality that came through the hall's high windows and transformed the stone floor and the old tapestries into something that belonged more to dream than day. She crossed it quietly, her trunk handled with care for the silence, and reached the front door and took the handle. She opened the door. He was there, not on the steps, not in the attitude of someone who had happened to be awake and was taking the morning air with any appearance of coincidence. He was standing at the base of the front steps on the gravel drive, in his coat and without a hat, in the frost-edged early dark of a Yorkshire morning at the end of November, and he had been there long enough that the frost had reached the shoulders of his coat. He was facing the house when she opened the door, which meant he had been waiting with his back to the moors and his face to the door, specifically, for some period of time that was not brief. In his left hand, he held a letter. She knew immediately which letter it was. She had come to know that paper, the particular cream of it, the slightly softened edges from many foldings. She had seen it on the desk in the East Wing's unsheeted room, and he had been carrying it, she understood now, in some form or other for 10 years. She came to the top of the steps. The frost was immediate, a cold that was not aggressive, but was total, the clean, absolute cold of a northern morning that has not yet decided to become a day. They looked at each other across the short distance of the steps, and the look had all of the previous 30 days in it at once, compressed and simultaneous, every dinner and every silence and every threshold pause and every managed expression and every unmanaged one. He said nothing immediately. She waited. "I read it again," he said. His voice in the cold air was quiet, carrying without effort. He held up the letter slightly, not displaying it, simply acknowledging what it was. "Last night. I read it more carefully than I have read it before, which is a pause, which is significant, because I have read it a great many times." "I know," she said. "I have been reading it as a document about what I did," he said, "as an account of my failure and her response to it. I have been," he stopped, looked down at the letter, then back at her. "I have been using it as evidence for the prosecution." She came down one step without meaning to. "It is not evidence for the prosecution," he said. "It is what it says it is. It is a letter from someone who knew me completely and is telling me, from that complete knowledge, that the accounting I have been living by is wrong. He paused. You told me the same thing. In the library, on the 14th evening. You told me the story I've been living in is not the one she wrote. He looked at her. I was not ready to hear it then. I was not certain I was ready to hear it last night. But I read it again, and I heard it. For the first time, I think. Actually heard it. The frost settled. The moors behind him were beginning to acquire the faintest distinction of horizon from sky. The first gray separation of an approaching day. You were going to leave without saying goodbye, he said. I was trying not to make you watch me go. I know. Something moved in his face, the old expression and the new one, the grief and the thing that had been growing alongside it for 30 days, present simultaneously and no longer competing. I know exactly why you were doing it. I have spent a decade performing similar kindnesses for myself, removing myself from situations that were likely to be painful before they could become so. A pause. It does not, it turns out, reduce the pain. It simply means you feel it alone. She came down another step. I read your letter as well, he said. The one you left on the desk. I came down early because I had made a decision and I wanted to make it before the day had time to talk me out of it. And Mr. Crewe said you had already, that you were, and I found the letter on the desk and I read it. And, she said. The word came out smaller than she intended. He looked at her, full, unmanaged, with everything visible that she had catalogued over 30 days, the grief, the composure's absence, the thing that had no name yet but would have one, she thought, shortly. And I have one thing left to say, he said, before you walk out of my gate and I lose the nerve I appear to have found, briefly and possibly irretrievably, at 4 in the morning in the frost. She came down the last step. They were the same level now, on the gravel, in the cold, with the letter between them. You came here for safety, he said. I understand that now, and I am not. The deception was real, and it mattered, and I am not pretending otherwise. But you stayed. You stayed past when safety was the only reason. You stayed through the east wing and the telling and the silence I gave you afterward, which was not, I was not. I handled it badly. I retreated. It is what I do. It is what I have always done. He paused. I am trying, with significant effort and mixed success, to do something different. What are you doing? She asked. Her voice was steady. She kept it steady. I am standing at my own gate, he said, in the frost, before the day has started, asking you not to leave. The moors behind him went a shade lighter. The horizon separated from the sky in a thin, clear line. The 30 days are complete, she said. Technically, by your own declaration. I know, he said. The declaration was, as I have been forced to acknowledge, at some length over the past week, not a particularly well-considered document. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, I came here in the gray hat because I thought it gave the appearance of having somewhere better to be. Something moved in his expression, the distant cousin of a smile, but nearer this time. Much nearer. And do you, he said, have somewhere better to be? She looked at the house behind him, at the dark stone of it, the watched windows, the enormous permanent fact of it in the morning. She thought about the library and the portrait gallery and the east wing's frozen rooms and the west dining room and the small drawing room in the storm. She thought about the shortbread with orange peel, which was a ridiculous thing to think about at this moment, and which she thought about anyway. No, she said. He held out his hand. She took it. The day began. The notice, as it turned out, was never formally rescinded. This was because Adrian Ashford did not believe in the revision of public documents as a method of correcting private truths, and because the notice had always been less about the 30 days than about what 30 days might, under the right conditions, accomplish, which was the delivery of one person to another in a setting stripped of all the usual social scaffolding that kept people at the distance society required of them. He acknowledged this in a conversation that took place several weeks after the frost and the gate and the held-out hand, with the particular dry precision that Alara had come to understand was his version of warmth. She acknowledged, in return, that the notice had also accomplished the delivery of herself to a place she could not be found by Gerald Fitch, and that these two achievements, the personal and the practical, had coexisted in productive tension throughout, which was perhaps a reasonable description of most worthwhile arrangements. Fitch arrived at the gates of Blackthorn Hall on the 23rd day, 3 days after the telling, while the silence was still in its early phase, and was informed by Mr. Crewe, at the gate and without visible emotion, that the Duke of Ravensmore was not receiving visitors, that the young woman he sought was under the protection of the estate and was not available to speak with anyone outside its walls, and that if he wished to make a formal legal inquiry, he was welcome to do so through the appropriate channels. And here was the name of the Duke's solicitor in York, who was expecting to hear from him. The documents Alara had carried for 8 months, transcribed with the careful accuracy of a woman who understood that precision might one day be the difference between justice and its absence, were placed in the hands of those solicitors within the week. The widow's estate was examined. The accounting was audited. Gerald Fitch spent the following year in a sequence of legal proceedings that consumed his considerable practical cleverness entirely and left none over for looking for women in Yorkshire. The widow's daughter eventually wrote a letter of thanks, so effusive it made Alara genuinely uncomfortable. But she kept it. Cecily Marsh's portrait remained in the gallery. This was also Adrian's decision, and it was, Alara thought, the right one, not because keeping it was comfortable, but because comfort was not the point. The point was that Cecily Marsh had been real, and had been good, and had deserved to be remembered with the full dignity of what she actually was rather than the reduced dimensions of a cautionary tale. The portrait stayed. The brass plate stayed. The dark eyes continued to look out from the last alcove before the western arch with that expression Alara had first catalogued as unreadable, and had since come to understand as the expression of someone who had known exactly what she was doing and had made her peace with it. The east wing was not unsealed. Alara had not asked for it to be, and Adrian had not offered, and this too was the right decision. Some rooms are not for living in, but for knowing about, and knowing about them is its own form of presence, its own form of respect. She understood, by the time the question did not need to be asked, that the stopped pianoforte and the covered harp and the desk with its paperweight scattering cold light were doing necessary work in the architecture of him, not as punishment, as he had used them for years, but as acknowledgment, as the kind of honest accounting that does not require the erasure of what was difficult in order to proceed. What they were, in the months that followed the frost morning at the gate, was something that resisted the categories available to them in 1843. They were not engaged in the formal sense. The proposal, when it came, was not the ceremony the notice had implied it would be. It was made in the library on a Tuesday afternoon in December, while she was on the upper walkway and he was on the lower level, and they were arguing with genuine investment about whether a second reading of a text necessarily produced a deeper reading or merely a different one. He said, in the middle of his counter-argument, and without any particular change of tone to signal the shift, "I would like you to stay. Not for the 30 days. Indefinitely." She had come down the spiral staircase. She had said yes with her hands and her proximity before she said it in words, which was also typical. And he had received it with the particular expression she had catalogued most precisely of all his expressions, the one that lasted longer than the others because it did not require management, the one that looked like the specific sensation of something one had been holding very tightly being safely set down. The announcement, when it was made, for these things require announcement, even when the only audience that matters is very small, appeared not in the Gazette, but in a brief private communication to a select handful of people whose interest in the matter was genuine rather than prurient. Mrs. Hartwell in Cheapside received a letter and sat down in her chair with an expression that moved through several emotional stages before arriving at the one she was too private to express and too honest to deny. Mr. Crewe received the news in the way Mr. Crewe received all news, with the composure of a man who had, in this particular case, seen it coming for some time and had arranged the household accordingly. The ton, broadly, was divided. Lady Pemberton found the entire business irregular. Lord Cawthorne said he had known the Duke would eventually come round, and was corrected on this point by his wife, who had a clearer memory of his exact predictions, and pointed out that what he had actually predicted was the woman leaving before the fortnight. The Duchess of Elmswick, who had said nothing could surprise her, was not surprised. She read the announcement, set it aside, and returned to her embroidery with the small, specific satisfaction of a woman who has outlived enough of the world's narratives to recognize, occasionally, the good ones. The curse, which had never been a curse, which had always been a story told by a man about himself, and subsequently hardened into reputation, did not break in any dramatic way. It did not lift in a moment of climax, or resolve in a storm, or vanish with any of the Gothic satisfactions the stories about it had implied it would. It dissolved instead, gradually, in the ordinary conditions of two people sharing a house and a table and a library and a set of ongoing arguments about texts and weather and the proper method of making tea, until the distinction between cursed and uncursed was no longer meaningful, and the house was simply a house, large, dark, remarkable, very cold in certain corridors, and fully, genuinely inhabited for the first time in a decade. Blackthorn Hall in spring was a different proposition than Blackthorn Hall in November. Alara had not expected that, had not thought about the seasonal variation of a place whose reputation was so thoroughly wintry. But in March, the trilene that had swallowed the sun since 1801 began to lighten at the edges as the birches leafed out, and the gardens that had been all bare-bone structure through the winter acquired their softer second grammar of growth, and the moors beyond the eastern boundary went through a color change so gradual and so complete that she found herself standing at the rear garden wall on a morning in April watching them go from winter gray to the particular damp green of a northern spring, and feeling something she identified, after a moment of honest examination, as joy. Not the uncomplicated joy of someone for whom everything had been easy. The specific, earned joy of a person who has been genuinely afraid and is now genuinely safe, who understands the value of safety precisely because she has a comprehensive knowledge of its absence. It was not the same thing as ease. It was better than ease. It was the feeling of ground that held. She was still standing at the wall when she heard him behind her on the gravel path. He came to stand beside her. He looked at the moors. She looked at the moors. He was silent in the way. He was silent when he had something to say and was deciding how to say it, which he had learned was different from his other silences and required only the particular quality of available stillness that she had, over the course of a winter, become rather good at providing. Your father, he said at last, would have had many questions about the color change. He said it the way people say things they have been thinking about for a while, with the specificity of a thought that has been held long enough to become precise. She turned to look at him. He was already looking at her, and the expression on his face in the April morning, not the managed composure of the first 30 days, not the grief of the East Wing, not the weight of 10 years of a story wrongly told, was the expression she had been cataloging since the frost morning at the gate and had not yet found the right word for. She thought she had the word now. It was home. Not Blackthorn Hall, not the Duke of Ravensmoor, not the resolution of a dare that had been, from its inception, a question dressed in the language of a wager. Just him, the particular quality of him, gray-eyed and precise and learning, slowly and imperfectly and with genuine effort, to keep the door open rather than sealed, to let the letter mean what it had always meant, to understand that the story you live in is the story you choose to tell, and that choosing requires the willingness to set down what you've been carrying and look at it in honest light, and say, this version is wrong. I am going to write a different one. That was what Blackthorn Hall had been all along. Not a curse, not a haunting, not a dare for the amusement of a restless society or a fortress for the protection of a man who had confused isolation with safety. A question. The question was, whoever survives 30 days in the presence of everything I am afraid of becoming, the tenderness and the grief and the wanting and the terrible vulnerability of allowing someone to see me clearly and not requiring them to look away, whoever survives that, without flinching and without fleeing, without reducing what they find to a story simpler than the truth of it, what is that person to me? Alara Voss had an answer. She gave it to him in the April morning at the garden wall, with the moors going green behind them and the birches leafing out along the trilene, and the house holding its long, patient breath at their backs. He received it with both hands. The story, for both of them, was just beginning.